The following was recorded in front of a live studio audience at the Studio 21 Podcast Café. This is the United Podcast Network.
Want to shake up your small business marketing? I mean, really shake it up.
Studio 21 Podcast Café.
Have you been thinking about doing your own podcast?
Studio 21 Podcast Café.
Would you like to take your business to the next level?
Studio 21 Podcast Café.
This is the golden age of podcasting, and it's time to stop thinking and start doing.
Studio 21 Podcast Café.
Get your message heard 24/7, 365, over and over again.
Studio 21 Podcast Café.
Welcome to the 21st century.
Welcome to the Studio 21 Podcast Café.
Here's the creator and host of the Studio 21 Podcast Café, David Garofalo.
Welcome, everybody, and welcome to the Studio 21 Podcast Cafe. This is a 21-minute or less weekly podcast to help you, the podcaster, get your message out, grow your business, and build your bottom line. Let me help you bring your marketing, advertising, and promotions into the 21st century. My name is David Garofalo. I've been doing podcasting since 2010 and created a six-figure income from doing my podcast. And you can too. So I want to help you with that. It's a 21-minute podcast, so let's start the clock. And here we go. Today, to perfect the podcast interview. That's what we're going to try to do. The perfect podcast interviewer. And to do that, the podcaster must become a chameleon. They actually have to be able to change. Remember the Delicious Dish parody on the Saturday Night Live show from NPR, National Public Radio? The two monotone ladies that were talking about their foods and things with Delicious Sweaty Balls guy. Do you remember that? They interviewed Pete Sweaty, and Pete actually mimicked them in the interview. He became them. They were interviewing him, and he became the same monotone voice and talked exactly the same way both of those ladies did. If you remember that parody, and if you don't, Ed's got a little sound effect on it, so you'll hear it here.
Please welcome the owner of Seasons Eatings, Pete Sweaty.
Welcome. How are you?
Welcome, Pete.
We like the name of your store.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Oh. Now, did I pronounce your name correctly?
You sure did. Pete Sweaty.
Well, Pete, Terry and I have been looking forward to having you on the show because we know you're the master of all kinds of Christmas goodies. Tell us about them.
Well, there are lots of great treats this time of year. Zucchini bread, fruitcake. But the thing that I most like to bring out at this time of the year are my balls.
So you hear that. He's talking, he's mimicking or mirroring them. So is that how Pete really was in real life? Now, not real life, it was a sitcom anyway, but if they were interviewing somebody, you saw that interviewer interviewed them in a low monotone voice. Both of the women did, and he became them. He became mirroring their style. And that was with monotone, without energy, without much personality. That's what ends up happening with a lot of podcasters. They could turn into the person they're interviewing, or the interviewer can be the head of the show, and they will become the person being interviewed will become them. And that's what I want to talk to you about today. Actually, most of the shows on NPR mimic each other. Not just the people on the existing show, but every show itself mimics each other's show. If you listen to the NPR, there's actually a style to it, and everybody mimics that style of what it is, for good or bad. Actually, they have lots of listeners, more listeners than we have on here, so maybe there's something good about it. But the point is, it's all the same, and when somebody new comes onto the show, it becomes the same thing. It becomes a mimic of their. But this is your show. You're doing your show. They should be mimicking you. What do you want your show to be like? When you get a guest on the show, you want them to sound like the interviewer. And how do you make that happen? It is mirroring. It is mirroring. Tough word to say, right? Mirroring. The guest is a mirror of the interviewer. So what am I saying here? The podcaster should be the influencer to the guest. If you sound like that, then they probably will too. What do you want them to sound like? If you're fun and happy and excited, your guests will probably jump in to a higher level. If they're not that type of person, they'll at least move up at the very least to another level. If you end up being down on them, they'll end up coming down to another level. They make it down to your lowest level, wherever you are. In that particular wow, I'm tongue-tied today. In that particular, this is where you see we don't do any editing here. In that particular case with Pete Schweddy, might be an upbeat, exciting guy, but those ladies stayed strong to the NPR style, and so did Pete Schweddy. Do you think Pete would sound differently if he was interviewed by somebody like Howard Stern, for instance? I think it would sound altogether different. I think Pete would mirror Howard at that point. Actually, most people who have been interviewed by Howard act differently than they normally do. He's a great interviewer, and that's what ends up happening. They act different, and they say things differently than they normally would because he takes charge of the interview. They didn't intend to say it to Howard, but he pulled it out of them because he can do that, because he is a great interviewer. So a person being interviewed says stuff that they normally wouldn't. They act in a way they normally wouldn't. They go up, they go down, wherever it is, because they are mirroring him. A great interviewer can do that. A great interviewer knows it's their show and brings the person they are interviewing into their show. If you're a podcaster and you have a show, it's your show. And the person being interviewed should be mirroring you. But it always doesn't work out like that, unfortunately. On the other hand, should you, or when should you, be mirroring the guest? When you are looking to mirror, understand that mirroring is a practice of adopting another person's behaviors, mannerisms, and the ways of speaking. First, body posture, sitting straight up or slouched down. This is before the show even starts. Sitting straight ahead, sitting to the side. If my body posture is sitting straight up, the person that's mirroring me, the guest, is going to make those changes. If they end up slouching down, you can imagine it's going to be more of a laid-back show. Before the record button even happens, you're going to turn that person into a different person as that happens. Hand gestures, folding your hands, or just swinging them around as you're talking. It's a whole different thing. If you're moving your hands around when you're talking, you're creating some excitement, and you're bringing the person into it a little more lively than you would if you folded your hands like those two ladies did on there. Their monotone voice, they're sitting straight up. That's what happened there. What do you want to happen to your show? Your voice, your tone, your volume, your rate of speech. The faster I talk, the more exciting it may get. The louder I talk, the more exciting it may get than if I had a low monotone voice. And that would be, if I was interviewing somebody right now, they would be interviewing back the same way. What do you want? It's not what's right and what's wrong, it's what do you want. This one you should stay away from. Head movements, a nod, a tilt of the head. It's a podcast. They can't be heard. A nod can't be heard. So try not to do that to your guests so they don't mirror you back. And it's a nod. Hey, what do you think of that? And your head goes up and down. Well, nobody can hear that. It's not doing anybody any good. Same goes for facial expressions. Although some people believe, and I believe so also, a smile can be heard. If you're smiling during the interview as somebody's talking to you, your voice changes and you can hear that I'm smiling right now. It can be heard, but most of the things can't. But when you have a remote guest, when it's a call-in, how does the mirror work at that point? It's not getting the mirror down at that point. You're not able to see them. And we're going to get to that in just 1 minute.
If you're in the area of Boston North into southern New Hampshire and you're thinking about doing a podcast, there is a place you have to see. It's called Studio 21 Podcast Café. Located right over the border into Salem, New Hampshire, Studio 21 Podcast Café is a live, working, full-service podcast and vodcast that's video on demand studio. All professional equipment, professional producer, and total distribution of your podcast is done for you. Would you like search engine optimization for more people to find your business or better ranking on Google? Well, Studio 21 Podcast Cafe can do it all for you for far less than you think. Schedule a free 21-minute no obligation consultation by going to www.studio21podcast.cafe. That's studio21podcast.cafe. Now back to the program.
And we are back, and today we're talking about perfecting the podcast interviewer. The podcaster must become a chameleon, or the person being interviewed must adapt to them and mirror them. And we can do that, but it really gets tough during the podcast interviewing when it's a phone call, when they're bringing somebody into the show that's actually not there. The body language thing is gone. In a face-to-face, body language could have helped you decide really fast and be able to adapt to the style or force your style upon them. But this face-to-face thing is gone at this point because now you are doing this over the phone, so it gets much more difficult. Body language works in the studio, but really not so much over the phone. Even if you're only going to do audio, right? You're only doing a podcast. You're not going to incorporate vodcasting, video on demand onto this. You're not going to use the ability to put it live on Facebook or to put it on YouTube. It's just audio only is what you're doing. You're doing editing and things after, but you're going to receive a call from them. I highly recommend to you using video. Skype them in if possible so that you can actually see them and they can see you. This is going to help with the purpose of the body language type of thing. You can use the body language by seeing them at least on video, and it's going to help out if at all possible. The audio was fine, right? When you end up Skyping?
Yep, the audio. It's going to give you a better quality audio than if you're dialing them from Skype on a landline, right? Because telephones just don't have the range that you're going to get on the Skype call.
So it's the way to go, plus you got the additional thing of being able to see the body language of them. It is important to keep the levels the same. Your level and the person that's on the phone, their level, to be the same. There is nothing worse, and I listen to podcasts myself, there's nothing worse, in my opinion, than riding the pod. And that means the volume control. And this is what Ed does. We have a producer here in the Studio 21 Podcast Cafe that does that. As I'm talking to you, you're riding the volumes to make sure it's right.
That's my life in the studio, but I don't want to do it when I'm listening to a podcast.
Absolutely. It's tough to do while you're driving the car, and each person is talking and you're riding it. It's also tough to do it if you're doing it, listening at the gym, and you're riding it, and trying, if you're going to say, okay, I'm not going to ride the pod, I'm just going to listen to it as it is. How unenjoyable is that? Listening to one person at a high volume, one at a low volume, it's like playing a trick with your brain.
I can't do it anymore.
Yeah.
You know, it doesn't matter how good the content is. If they're not at the same level, I'm not going to spend the time to turn it up, turn it down.
Right. So this is what ends up happening when you go to the person on the call. And it is important to keep the levels the same. As I say, nothing worse than riding it. If possible, practice before the show even starts. And what we do is the test call, right?
Right.
And we may do it days in advance.
Yep, but I mean, it's important to try to get the guest in the environment that they're going to do the interview from. Right, and then you'll see, okay, well, if they're in a big, wide-open room with hardwood floors, you've got some echo to deal with. But
over the years of doing our podcast, we've done the test call with them, and they'll be in a quiet, closed office. And then the day of the podcast, they're outdoors.
Or they're in their car on a cell phone. You know?
And it's like, why did we do this? We didn't do it to say, wow, this works. We know it works.
And, you know, there is a little bit of a difference because we're just broadcasting live. Right. So if you're recording the guest and you're going to do post-production, the test call just happens at the same time before the interview.
Imagine the post-production, though, that the two levels are off the whole time. You're a producer. Can you imagine the work? You're going to spend more time actually in post-production than the show itself, and I don't care how long it is. It'll be triple, quadruple the amount of time.
Yep, and especially if you're fairly new to it and you're not that familiar with the tools, you'll never quite get it right.
Yeah.
So, I mean, the best thing you can do is make sure the levels are right for the recording.
Yeah, and it's even if they don't have the equipment you do, you have a nice mic and nice headset, and they don't. You can make it so that they mirror each other in a certain degree that they're there. So we're talking about mirroring of the person, of their personality and how they're going to act, but the mirroring of the volume is going to be an important thing, and that's you. That's you, the person doing the podcast. If you don't have a producer and then you're doing it yourself, it is key. Ask questions you already know the answers to when you're interviewing somebody, especially that they're not there in front of you, like the website and the phone numbers. Help them in case they get stuck. You need to have that information there. You don't know. They're miles away from you. You're doing the interview of it. If you're going to ask them something that you don't have the answers to, if they get stuck, you're no help to them. And your job as an interviewer is to actually make them seem good, right? If you want to keep people coming on your show, it's going to be a key. Make them look good, and you'll get more interviews in the future.
I think one thing that's helpful to make them look good is give them some guidance on the equipment on their end. I mean, not everybody has studio quality stuff, but the biggest thing they can do is wear some headphones, and everybody's got some. But, you know, if you got
earbuds, anything, something.
Because if you got that noise coming off their speaker, it's not good.
Right.
Now, the other thing then is ideally they have a good microphone.
Yeah.
You know, we did an interview of a guy who's into podcasting, and it sounded like he was in the studio with us when we talked to John, you know. But
he had the right equipment, and he made himself sound good, and he made our show sound good. So that's nice when they're working in line with you. You're going to find most it's going to be quite the opposite.
And our job is to make the guests sound good.
Right. And they'll be happy with it. They'll end up sharing the podcast because they sounded so good to it, which is getting us more listeners, and more listeners will get us more advertisers, and more advertisers will make more money. And this is the thing that ends up happening. So it starts at the very beginning of your equipment, and then it starts with your interview style and making the person sound good. And, you know, all of this becomes part of the monetization part of it. So as we tell these things on the Studio 21, it all comes down to the successful podcast itself, and a successful podcast to me is monetization. It's lots of listens. It's giving lots of good information out there about, you know, one way to measure it is going to be monetization, and unless you're doing these key things, you're going to have a tough time with monetization. Make them look bad, and you will be shunned. You will not only be shunned from them, anybody that is looking to do you ask somebody to do your podcast, and they go on to old podcasts and saw that you made a listener, somebody you interviewed, sound bad, and most likely they're going to push away and say, oh my God, I'm not up for that. So you need a plan, and you need to plan the interview out well, including the tone and the speed of it. How do you want it to sound? If you're talking about something tragic or something, you probably want to slow it down and get into the tragedy of what it is. If you're talking about something uplifting, you better pick it up and end up talking about it, and not be those girls that are on that show. I mean, that was a joke. It's supposed to be a joke, and as far as I listen to that, and I say, it's terrible.
It's only funny because they are mimicking what NPR does. You know, this fresh air sort of thing. We were listening to that.
Right, yeah. And despite that, they have successful shows on there anyway. What do you want your show to be like? That's up to you. Have a plan. Do you? Need help on a plan? I'd love to work with you. I think I can help. Contact me at dave@studio21podcast.cafe. That's dave@studio21podcast.cafe. Schedule a free 21-minute meeting with me. Let me show you the studio. We'll talk about your thoughts and plans, and I'll even buy you a cup of coffee. That's it for this week. Next week, engineering your podcast. Ed, I'm going to go to you. You're going to be a big help on this one.
I hope I am.
Yeah, I hope so. You know it better than I do. I don't do it. I have somebody do it for me. But in case you want to do it for yourself, Ed's going to help you along the way with this one. What to do and what not to do. Engineering your podcast. That's my 21 minutes or less, and we are out of here. You've been listening to the Studio 21 Podcast Cafe, live from the Studio 21 Podcast Cafe on the United Podcast Network.
The views and opinions expressed by the hosts, guests, or callers of this program do not necessarily reflect the opinions of the Studio 21 Podcast Cafe, the United Podcast Network, its partners, or affiliates.